Hey everyone, this is part 2 of the Equitable Hiring / Promotion video. In our last video, we debunked the years of experience in just 7 steps. In this video, we're going to focus on highlighting why it's critical to move towards task-based experience instead of using time-based experience. Now, there's minimal scientific or statistical evidence that demonstrates how individuals with more time spent on Earth or more time in a certain role are actually more competent, or even if they perform better. And 90% of all companies are still using years of experience to filter out job resumes and select candidates who have more time exposure, not work experience. And there's a key difference between years of experience versus years of exposure. Now for this first example, when we were younger, we remember when there was 1 or 2 students that failed the 11th or 12th grade numerous times before graduating. Now by the definition of years of experience, we'd have to say that they're definitely more experienced than us. But did that make them more proficient at the time? No, even I was a high school dropout that later became a doctor later on in life. Now for the second example, let's take a modern society look at this and view how organizations like Amazon and Google have half the amount of experience of their competitors, yet they outperform in numerous ways and have some of the most loyal customers in the market. So ask yourself, why are we using years of experience? Better yet, what's the impact if we keep using it? The impact is that there are several factors that cause organizations to overlook competent professionals with high levels of task proficiency. Number 1 would be ATS bots used to scan our resumes for keywords, and they don't capture the behavioral or characteristic attributes of the candidate. Number 2, a lack of trained professionals in HR. These roles don't typically hire expertise psychologists or scientists. There's also a workforce gap in HR for professionals that are competent in IT and cybersecurity. So they also have trouble evaluating our skills, and they're forced to guess by referencing time spent in the field. Now number 3, this mandate for years of exposure, not experience, has no math or science behind it, and it's further stifling the workforce gap. Now there are decades of research that has consistently proven that task-based experience is superior to time-based experience. For instance, you could have a professional with 10 years of exposure who performed a task 50 times, and they may not be as proficient as a professional with 2 years of exposure who performed the same task 250 times. Now our study did further support the Dunning-Kruger effect, and the Dunning-Kruger effect means that confidence does not typically align with performance. In fact, as age increases, so does confidence. But guess what? These were the average performers, or the novice performers out of our sample. And what this means is that humility is key, as well as continued learning to keep up with your field. However, years of experience overshadows this fact, and it makes unrealistic assumptions based on little data. Now let's talk about how years of experience disadvantages women, minorities, and older professionals looking for a career change. Now women were some of the first minorities in the workplace, and it usually takes them longer to get in positions of authority. And when you examine the typical organization chart or that pyramid, both women and minorities start to appear to be more scarce in these leadership roles. Now roles in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM, traditionally have not been filled by people of color or women. And as a result, both groups are less exposed, quote, experienced. Now scientifically, in systems thinking, we call this an archetype, and specifically this is called the success to the successful, or to the victor belongs the spoils. Now this occurs when a person could belong to a certain group that is historically successful and more exposed, and they have innate advantages like a richer network of successful colleagues, or a richer network of family members to use as a reference, or even more access to better education and training, or simply growing up in a culture that is more exposed to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now unintentionally, this phenomenon eliminates competition. Now if you're a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion, you need to bring this to the attention of your organization and your HR immediately. And this is not only for D&I. This is not just a D&I focus here. This also hurts students right out of college, challenged with meeting unrealistic expectations for these job descriptions for an entry-level position. But it also disadvantages the hard-working older professionals looking for a career change. And now that gets us on the subject of ageism. Now the main takeaway here is that time-based experience requires absolutely no effort. What we're saying here, without saying it, is simply live longer and you will get rewarded. But this fallacy lacks empathy because none of us know how long we have left on Earth or what will happen from day to day or week to week. What's even more unfortunate is that many of our hiring managers today were in the exact same position you are today, and they've lost their empathy and they've lost their understanding. So let's do our part to help them see things more objectively. In this example, we're going to pretend like we're down to 2 job candidates, and we have to make a decision on who to hire based only on the data we are presented. And we're going to start with years of experience here. So candidate A has 5 years of experience, and candidate B has 10 years of experience. Now, when we asked this question at 2 previous international conferences at ISACA, over 90% of the audience chose candidate B. And this is the typical example in the hiring process, right? Now, most people who have less years of exposure are not going to make it past this point. And that's unfortunate because look what happens next. When we look at the number of tasks performed, now a curious leader, not a manager, a curious leader will dig into their experience further, and they'll learn that candidate A has performed a certain task on the job description 100 times versus candidate B, who's only performed it 50 times. Now you're probably thinking, what has candidate been doing with the other 5 years of experience, right? But let's keep going. Let's dig into this a bit further. There's hours spent performing the task. Now these are fictitious numbers here, but candidate A has 8,000 hours of task performance versus candidate B, who only has 5,000 hours of task performance. So we're only down to 3 bullet points here. Who's still going with candidate B? Or do you think we should give candidate A another chance? Call them. Tell them we jumped the gun too soon based on the little data that we have, and we would like to welcome them to our team. But let's jump one level further. Levels of task quality. Candidate A has high levels of task quality over their 5 years of experience versus candidate B that has average levels of task quality over their 10 years of experience. Now, as an expertise psychologist, we do not rely on time to evaluate expertise. We consider the following factors: task quantity, which means how many times did you actually perform this task within 4 hours? We also have task quality. Did you perform the task to high standards? Task capacity, how many tasks can you perform simultaneously or within a 4-hour time period? And lastly, we have task speed. How much faster are you than the average performer? Notice how we don't care about how much time you lived on Earth or how much time you've been in a position. We objectively observe what you can do and assess the quality of your training so that we can improve our training, our educational roadmap. In other words, you just don't get grandfathered into a practice because you've been in a role longer. No, we're obligated to keep up with our profession and protect society. Now we want to take a good look at experience versus knowledge, and this has been a recurring phenomenon since 1986. While drinking 26 packs a day may make one experienced, heavy, and drunk, it would not necessarily make one an expert on beer. Personally encountering or being exposed to something does not equate to expertise, and any measure that assumes to assess expertise needs to do so objectively in a way that can reflect knowledge and skill. Years of experience versus years of exposure. Now, this is an IT audit example, so forgive me for the specificity here. But for example, an auditor may have 25 years of auditing experience, but exhibit no more expertise in evaluating internal control. Now, this is a task. Than another auditor with 4 years of experience. Why? Because only 4 of the former 25 years actually involved the task of reviewing internal control. Great example of years of experience versus years of exposure. So why are we still gatekeeping? Don't organizations know that years of experience is not objective and it hurts their minority workforce, their women in the profession, as well as older professionals when we talk about ageism? Well, the answer is that they probably don't, because we've all become victims to the echo chamber or the saturation effect, where the more often something is repeated, the more likely it seems to be true without any skepticism or further investigation. Now, why would people be adverse to task-based experience versus time-based experience? Well, there's a whole network of us that have been in this field for decades. Now, unfortunately, there's also a great deal of us who may not kept up their education or their skills. Now, this threatens their livelihood as well. It threatens their ability to support their family. It threatens their ability to continue advancing. Now, in my opinion, I think grandfathering into the practice was okay many years ago. But that was before we started to mature and start using science to improve our profession just like other fields. However, now that your organization, your diversity, equity, and inclusion teams, and managers know that these practices are unequitable, they need to move towards objective hiring and promotion practices and move away from creating their own proprietary practices. And I'll show you why that's not equitable, and we'll get into that more in our next video. Another reason why people will be adverse is that this levels the playing field. I can no longer just rely on my many years of exposure to get through the door now. This job may require me to complete some type of assessment, maybe a competency assessment, a virtual scenario, or actual tasks during the hiring process. And if I haven't kept up with my skills, I don't get the job. And I think we would want the same from our surgeons and our doctors, right? Well, we work in a field where we also support surgeons and doctors and nurses. Now remember, we forget 35 to 40% of what we learn after 5 years in our field. That is, if we do not continuously train ourselves with increasingly complex tasks. In fact, our father of expertise, Anders Ericsson, stated that only 2 of 62 studies had found doctors to actually gotten better with more experience. And in another study with 10,000 clinicians found that actual additional professional experience had a very small effect, because there's a year of experience and there's a year of exposure, and there's a key distinction there. Both HR and managers blindly assume that years of experience increases performance. But if you ask them, why do you believe this is true? They'll probably cite the 10,000 hour rule. Now, unfortunately, the 10,000 hour rule isn't science, and it was actually created by a journalist, not a scientist. That journalist's name was Malcolm Gladwell. Now, Gladwell accidentally misinterpreted Anders Ericsson's original study, where he recorded the practice times of the best violin students by the time they were 18. Interestingly, Gladwell chose to refer to the total practice time they had accumulated by the time they were 20. And he did so because it was a nice round number. Now, that's cited from Anders Ericsson's book called Peak. Now, my study has provided further evidence to debunk the 10,000 hour rule in the year of experience fallacy. And in our next video, we're going to talk about how to objectively hire and promote professionals and start maturing technology and cybersecurity into an actual discipline and a profession. Now, the main takeaway here is that although we have put many years into this profession, it doesn't mean the world or the industry owes us anything. Instead, we are obligated to keep up with our profession, since we protect critical infrastructure for every other profession in the world. Okay, everyone, I'd like to thank you all for viewing, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.